Many people believe they are honest with themselves, but are they really? Self-deception is a psychological trap in which a person believes their own lies to avoid discomfort. Instead of facing the truth, they construct justifications. They say they love their job, but feel a tightness in their chest every Monday. They claim their relationship is healthy, even when arguments have become routine. The problem isn't just the momentary illusion, but what happens in the long term. Ignoring reality doesn't make it disappear. It only pushes the consequences into the future. Many prefer to cling to comforting illusions rather than face uncomfortable truths. This explains why so many remain in situations that cause them suffering. Instead of admitting that a job is destructive or that a friendship has become toxic, they convince themselves that things will get better. The fear of facing change is what keeps many people stuck in negative patterns. It's easier to believe that fate is responsible for unhappiness than to admit that wrong choices were made. But how long can one run from the truth before reality demands its price? Over time, this denial transforms into something more dangerous, an internal conflict that erodes self-esteem. When someone repeatedly tells themselves they're fine, but deep down feels the opposite, their mind begins to resist the truth. This disconnect generates anxiety, frustration, and, in many cases, a state of apathy. The person convinces themselves there's no way out and stops trying to change. But there's a limit to this escape. The truth can be ignored for a while, but never forever. And when it finally imposes itself, the impact can be devastating. What stops so many people from recognizing this process before it's too late? Part of the answer lies in how the brain deals with contradictions. When someone believes one thing but acts in opposition to it, a mental discomfort arises. This psychological tension leads to unconscious justifications to ease the discomfort. To relieve this feeling, people often distort their perception of reality. Instead of admitting the inconsistency, they create justifications that make the contradictions more acceptable. A classic example of this is someone who considers themselves honest but lies when it suits them. To avoid guilt, they justify, "It was just this once, everyone does it." This momentary relief prevents the reality from being confronted, and over time, these small lies accumulate, forming an invisible trap. In the book Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me, Tavries and Aronson explain that cognitive dissonance causes people to modify their beliefs to fit their actions, rather than changing their actions to align with their belief. This explains why so many convince themselves that at least it pays the bills when they hate their job, or why someone unhappy in a marriage insists that it's just a phase. This defense mechanism can be useful in small, everyday situations, but when it becomes a behavioral pattern, it carries profound consequences. Those who live ignoring their own inconsistencies lose confidence in themselves. Small concessions turn into major deviations, and soon the person finds themselves trapped in a life they no longer recognize as their own. Instead of facing the truth and making a difficult decision, the mind seeks excuses to sustain the illusion. But there's a cost to this: the weight of accumulated frustration. Over time, the discomfort grows until it becomes unbearable. Relationships deteriorate, opportunities are lost, and a feeling of stagnation sets in. The issue is that the more someone ignores this contradiction, the harder it becomes to break the cycle. The excuses become part of their identity, and in the end, the person isn't just deceiving others. They're deceiving themselves. But the problem doesn't stop there. The way we remember the past can also reinforce this self-deception. Human memory isn't a perfect record of events. On the contrary, it's malleable and influenced by emotions, beliefs, and justifications we create over time. Small details can be altered, uncomfortable parts can be forgotten, and in some cases, new versions of events can be created without the person even realizing it. This process happens subtly, making it one of the most dangerous forms of self-deception. Nietzsche expressed this clearly. "I did that," says my memory. "I couldn't have done that," says my pride, and remains inflexible. Finally, memory yields. This psychological mechanism explains why so many rewrite their own history to ease the weight of their mistake. When someone faces a difficult decision or fails in some area of life, their mind may reconstruct events in a way that minimizes their responsibility. A common example of this is when someone leaves a failed relationship and, instead of acknowledging their own mistakes, only remembers the other person's flaws. The narrative adjusts to keep their self-esteem intact, avoiding the discomfort of admitting that they, too, were partly at fault. This selective reinterpretation of the past prevents growth, as the person never honestly confronts the facts. Modern psychology has also identified the phenomenon of false memories. Studies show that the brain can fill gaps in old memories, distorting details or even creating events that never happened. When someone sees themselves as a constant victim of life, their mind may reconstruct their history to reinforce this view. Small past difficulties are amplified, neutral events take on a negative tone, and the present becomes a reflection of this constructed narrative. This becomes a dangerous cycle. Distorted memories reinforce self-deception, and self-deception shapes new memories. Someone who believes they've always been unlucky may unconsciously erase from their memory all the times they had good opportunities but failed to seize them. Meanwhile, someone who sees themselves as someone who never makes mistakes may rewrite events to convince themselves that all their decisions were justified. The problem is that by manipulating memory to protect their self-image, the person loses the chance to grow. When mistakes are denied and responsibilities shifted, there's no learning. And without learning, the same patterns repeat indefinitely. If the past is constantly adjusted to avoid discomfort, the future inevitably becomes a continuation of these illusions. But few areas of life are as affected by self-deception as relationship. Relationships are the arena where self-deception manifests most intensely and destructively. When someone doesn't want to see the truth about a relationship, whether romantic, familial, or friendly, they create justifications to avoid the discomfort of reality. Small warning signs are ignored, abusive behaviors are minimized, and empty promises are accepted as absolute truths. The fear of loneliness or change makes the illusion more comfortable than the truth. Many people insist on staying in dysfunctional relationships because they've convinced themselves that all relationships have ups and downs, or that no one is perfect. While it's true that no relationship is free of difficulties, there's a big difference between facing normal challenges and remaining in an emotionally draining environment. But when someone is deeply entangled in self-deception, these boundaries become blurred. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, argued that humans always have the freedom to choose their attitude toward circumstances. However, many people avoid this responsibility and distort reality to justify their choices. This same logic applies to many relationships. Instead of acknowledging that a partner, friend, or family member exhibits harmful behavior, the person convinces themselves that it's all part of a rough patch. Self-deception in relationships isn't limited to romantic love. It can be present in toxic friendships, where one person constantly takes advantage of the other, but the victim justifies it by saying, they only act like that because they're going through a hard time. It also occurs within families, when someone forces themselves to believe that a relative's destructive behavior is normal or that they don't mean any harm. The longer the person deceives themselves, the harder it becomes to break the cycle. Emotional exhaustion builds up, self-esteem weakens, and emotional dependence strengthens. This happens because admitting the truth means accepting that years were wasted in a relationship that never had a chance of working. This realization can be too painful, leading many people to remain trapped in unsustainable situations. But reality cannot be avoided forever. At some point, the signs become undeniable, and the emotional impact can be devastating. Lost time cannot be recovered, and the longer the illusion persists, the harder it becomes to deal with the shock of the truth. In the end, the big question isn't whether the person will see reality, but when. The difference is that those who become aware early can change their lives, while those who insist on self-deception often realize too late that they were clinging to something that was never real. Self-deception may seem harmless at first, but its effects accumulate over time. Small lies a person tells themselves shape their perception of reality, and the more they rely on these illusions, the harder it becomes to see the consequences. It's like a house of cards. It may seem solid for a while, but all it takes is a strong wind to bring it crashing down. At first, it might just be a vague discomfort, a faint feeling that something isn't right. But as time passes and problems pile up, the psychological impact intensifies. Someone who ignores their dissatisfaction at work may end up trapped in a purposeless career, unaware of how much it's affecting their mental health. Someone who forces themselves to believe that a bad relationship can still improve might waste precious years waiting for a change that will never come. This disconnect between reality and illusion creates deep emotional wear and tear. Those who deceive themselves about their problems begin to develop a constant fatigue, which can manifest as anxiety, lack of motivation, and even physical symptoms like headaches, insomnia, and muscle tension. This happens because the mind tries to ignore what needs to be confronted, but the body always finds a way to express that tension. Over time, self-deception can become such a strong defense mechanism that the person genuinely believes they have no control over their life. Justifications like, "I have no choice," or "it's too late to change" become absolute truths, preventing any attempt at transformation. This creates a dangerous cycle. The more someone deceives themselves, the harder it becomes to break the pattern, and the further their life drifts from what it could truly be. Moreover, living trapped in illusions weakens self-esteem. Those who grow accustomed to rationalizing their own poor choices end up doubting their ability to make the right decisions. This can lead to a state of apathy, where the person no longer seeks solutions to their problems because they believe nothing can be done. This sense of powerlessness can create a domino effect, impacting all areas of life: work, relationships, mental health, and even the way the person views themselves. In the long term, this pattern of self-deception can lead to severe existential crises. At some point, reality imposes itself, and when it happens abruptly, the shock can be devastating. Discovering that years were wasted on an illusion can lead to deep regret, a sense of failure, and a feeling of loss that's hard to overcome. Some people manage to use this pain as a catalyst for change, while others fall into a state of emotional paralysis, unable to cope with the truth. Ignoring problems today can mean facing an even bigger crisis in the future. Wasted time doesn't return, and the bill for self-deception always comes due. What seemed like a protective mechanism against pain ends up becoming the greatest source of suffering. Reality may be harsh, but facing it will always be the better choice in the long run. Carl Jung once said, "What you deny ends up controlling you." This concept perfectly encapsulates the impact of self-deception on the human psyche. When someone chooses to ignore an uncomfortable truth, that truth doesn't disappear. It simply hides in the subconscious and silently influences their decisions. This means that even if the person tries to move forward without addressing their problems, those problems will continue to affect their choices and behavior. Modern psychology explains that self-deception doesn't happen by accident. It's a defense mechanism of the brain to avoid emotional pain. The human mind has an innate need to maintain coherence between beliefs and actions. When there's a contradiction between what someone believes and what they actually do, cognitive dissonance arises, that mental discomfort that comes from realizing your actions don't align with your values. To avoid this uncomfortable feeling, the brain finds justifications that distort reality and protect the person's self-image. Humans have a natural tendency to avoid painful truths, preferring to justify their actions in ways that preserve their self-image. Someone who considers themselves a good person but acts selfishly may convince themselves that they had no choice or that their actions were justified. Someone who fails at a project might blame the unfair system instead of admitting they made mistakes. These small distortions accumulate and form a worldview where everything seems under control, even when it's not. Another fundamental aspect of self-deception is rationalization, a psychological process in which a person creates seemingly logical explanations to justify behaviors that, in reality, make no sense. This can be seen in everyday situations. A smoker might say, "I know someone who smoked their whole life and never had any problems," while someone unhappy in a marriage might repeat, "All relationships have ups and downs," ignoring clear signs that the relationship no longer works. Dostoevsky explored this theme in his works, portraying characters who destroyed themselves precisely because they couldn't face their own mistake. He described how some people create narratives to justify their actions, manipulating their own perception of reality to avoid guilt. This behavior not only hinders personal growth but also prevents the person from developing emotional maturity, as they always find a way to shift responsibility for their own failures. Neuroscience also shows that self-deception is linked to brain function. Studies indicate that certain areas responsible for processing emotions and memories work to soften painful memories and reinforce beliefs that maintain emotional stability. This means that, often, the person genuinely believes their own distortions because their brain unconsciously reconfigures their perception of events. But the major problem with self-deception is that it comes at a high cost. When someone convinces themselves that everything is fine when it's not, this illusion may bring temporary relief, but in the long term, it exacts a price. Constant denial of reality weakens self-confidence and keeps the person trapped in destructive cycles. Additionally, it prevents personal growth, as without recognizing mistakes and limitations, there's no way to correct them. The best way to combat this pattern is to develop self-awareness. This means constantly questioning one's own justifications and being willing to face uncomfortable truths. It's not about punishing or excessively criticizing oneself, but rather about looking at oneself with honesty and courage. After all, facing reality may be difficult, but living in an illusion is an even greater risk. The only way to escape self-deception is to face the truth head-on, without excuses or distortions. This requires courage, as the human brain has a natural instinct to avoid discomfort. Admitting that one spent years in a toxic relationship, wasted time in a purposeless job, or avoided necessary changes can be painful. However, the longer this confrontation is delayed, the greater the emotional impact when reality imposes itself. Carl Jung spoke about the need to integrate one's shadow, that is, to acknowledge all the parts of oneself that have been ignored or repressed. This includes flaws, weaknesses, and self-destructive behaviors that the person prefers not to see. Accepting these aspects doesn't mean blaming or punishing oneself, but rather taking responsibility for one's own choices. The first step to breaking the cycle of self-deception is developing a deep sense of self-awareness. Observing thoughts and behaviors without trying to justify them is already a significant step forward. A practical exercise to develop this awareness is keeping a reflection journal. Writing about feelings and thoughts without censorship allows the person to notice behavioral patterns and better understand their own reactions. Often, putting thoughts on paper helps identify lies that repeat over time. Another effective strategy is seeking honest feedback from trusted individuals, friends or mentors who aren't afraid to point out the truth, even when it's hard to hear. Additionally, questioning one's own narratives is essential. Many of the beliefs that sustain self-deception arise from the automatic repetition of justifications. Whenever an internal excuse for a bad situation arises, it's worth asking, is this really true, or just something I tell myself to feel better? This simple question helps break thought patterns that keep the person trapped in illusions. Another powerful tool for confronting self-deception is developing emotional resilience. Often, people deceive themselves because they're afraid to face the pain of reality. Learning to deal with frustrations, losses, and changes without taking refuge in fantasies allows the truth to be faced more calmly. Techniques like mindfulness, therapy, and philosophical practices can aid in this process. Carl Jung asserted that what you deny ends up controlling you. To live authentically, one must abandon the illusions that serve as protection and face reality as it is. This requires courage, but only by accepting our shadows can we achieve a state of true fulfillment. Living in denial might feel comfortable for a while, but it will never lead to growth. Those who want to change must have the courage to look at themselves in the mirror without filters. After all, reality might hurt, but nothing hurts more than living a lie. If you truly want to break free from this cycle and start seeing the truth about yourself, I've prepared something special to help you. In the first pinned comment, you'll find exclusive material that will guide you through this process of self-discovery and transformation. If this content resonated with you, leave a like and let me know in the comments what stood out to you the most.